My dear friends, let us consider for a moment the curious paradox that lies at the heart of human experience. The idea that our lowest points, our moments of deepest despair, can often be the very foundation upon which we build our greatest triumphs. It's a notion that flies in the face of our natural inclinations, that challenges our understanding of success and failure, and yet it holds within it a profound truth that has the power to transform our lives. Think, if you will, of a time when you felt you had hit rock bottom. Perhaps it was the loss of a job, the end of a relationship, a personal failure that seemed to shatter your world. In that moment, it likely felt as though all was lost, as though you had reached the end of the road with nowhere left to go. But I put it to you that this rock bottom, this nadir of your experience, was not an end at all, but rather a beginning. You see, there is a peculiar alchemy that occurs when we find ourselves at our lowest point. It's as if the very act of falling, of hitting that metaphorical bottom, creates a kind of rebound effect. Like a rubber ball dropped from a great height, the harder we hit, the higher we have the potential to bounce back. But why is this? Why should our moments of greatest despair also be our moments of greatest opportunity? The answer, I believe, lies in the nature of rock bottom itself. When we hit rock bottom, we are stripped bare. All our pretenses, our carefully constructed facades, our self-deceptions, they all fall away, leaving us face to face with our true selves. It's a brutal unveiling, to be sure, but it's also an incredibly powerful one. For in that moment of absolute honesty, we have the chance to see ourselves as we truly are, without the distortions of ego or the blinders of complacency. Consider, if you will, the story of a man I once knew. He had built his life around his career, climbing the corporate ladder with single-minded determination. His success was his identity, his achievements the measure of his work. And then in the blink of an eye, it was all gone. Economic downturn, a company restructuring, and suddenly he found himself unemployed, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. At first, he was devastated. He felt as though he had lost not just his job, but his very self. He had hit rock bottom, and the impact was shattering. But as he sat amid the ruins of his former life, something remarkable began to happen. For the first time in years, he began to question the assumptions upon which he had built his existence. He began to ask himself what truly mattered, what he really wanted from life. It was a painful process, to be sure. But from that pain came clarity. He realized that his career, while important, was not the sum total of his worth as a human being. He discovered passions he had long neglected, relationships he had allowed to wither in his pursuit of success. And from that realization, he began to rebuild his life, not as a replica of what had been lost, but as something new, something truer to his authentic self. This, my friends, is the gift that rock bottom offers us, the gift of clarity, of perspective, of the opportunity to begin again with a cleaner slate and a wiser heart. But let us be clear, hitting rock bottom is not a pleasant experience. It's not something to be sought out or celebrated in itself. The pain, the despair, the sense of loss, these are real and they are profound. To suggest otherwise would be to trivialize the very real suffering that accompanies our lowest moment. No, the power of rock bottom lies not in the falling, but in how we choose to rise. It's in the decisions we make when we find ourselves at the bottom, in the courage we summon to stand up again, in the wisdom we gain from examining the past. When you're standing on level ground, your view is limited. You can see what's immediately around you, but the horizon is obscured, the broader landscape hidden from view. But when you're at the bottom of a deep hole, something curious happens. You look up and suddenly you can see the stars. Your perspective shifts, expands. You see things you never noticed before. This is what rock bottom offers us, a new perspective, a chance to look up and see possibilities we might have missed when we were standing on supposedly solid ground. But I can almost hear some of you thinking, that's all well and good, but how do we actually do this? How do we turn our moments of deepest despair into opportunities for growth and renewal? It's a fair question and one that deserves careful consideration. The first step, I believe, is acceptance. We must accept where we are without judgment or self-recrimination. This doesn't mean we have to like our situation, but we must acknowledge it fully. Denial that most tempting of escapes will only prolong our stay at the bottom. Either you find yourself at the bottom of a hole, the first step to getting out is not to pretend you're not in a hole at all. It's to look around, assess your situation, and acknowledge, yes, I am indeed at the bottom of a hole. This acceptance, painful though it may be, is incredibly liberating. It frees us from the exhausting work of keeping up appearances, of pretending that everything is fine when it clearly is not. It allows us to direct our energy not towards maintaining a facade, but towards genuine growth. Once we've accepted our situation, the next step is to look for the lessons it has to offer. Every failure, every setback, every rock bottom moment carries within it seeds of wisdom, if only we have the courage and discernment to find them. What led me to this point? What choices did I make? What assumptions did I hold? That contributed to my fall. This isn't about assigning blame or wallowing in regret. It's about understanding, about gaining insight that can guide us as we begin to climb again. I'm reminded of another story, this one about a woman who had struggled with addiction for years. Time and again, she had tried to quit, only to fall back into old patterns. Each relapse felt like hitting rock bottom all over again. But one day, after a particularly devastating spiral, she realized something profound. Her rock bottom wasn't a place of ending, but a place of beginning. It was the point from which she could finally see the full extent of her addiction, the toll it had taken on her life and the lives of those around her. From that realization came a new resolve. She understood that her addiction wasn't just about the substance she was using, but about deeper issues she had been avoiding. Her rock bottom became the foundation upon which she built a new life, one based on self-awareness, honesty, and a commitment to growth. This woman's story illustrates another crucial aspect of rising from rock bottom, the importance of honesty. When we're at our lowest point, we have the opportunity to be brutally honest with ourselves in a way that's often difficult when things are going well. We can confront truths about ourselves and our lives that we might have been avoiding or denying. This honesty, painful though it may be, is incredibly powerful. It's like cleaning out a wound. It might sting, but it's essential for true healing to be. But perhaps the most important thing to remember when we find ourselves at rock bottom is this: we are not alone. It's easy in our darkest moments to feel isolated, to believe that no one else could possibly understand our pain or our struggle. But this is an illusion, a trick of the mind that serves only to deepen our despair. The truth is, every single person you meet, every individual who has ever lived, has had their own rock bottom moments. The details may differ, the circumstances may vary, but the essential experience, that feeling of having fallen, of having failed, of having lost our way, is universal. Understanding this can be incredibly comforting. It reminds us that our struggles, however personal they may feel, connect us to the broader human experience. It assures us that if others have found their way out of the depths, so too can we. Moreover, recognizing our shared humanity in moments of struggle opens us up to the possibility of connection and support. When we're willing to be vulnerable, to admit our failures and our pain, we often find that others respond with compassion and understanding. We discover that we're not as alone as we thought we were. I'm reminded of a story I once heard about a support group for people who had lost their jobs. One member described how, for weeks after losing his job, he had isolated himself, too ashamed to reach out to friends or family. But when he finally gathered the courage to attend the support group, he was amazed to discover a room full of people who understood exactly what he was going through. In sharing his story and listening to others, he found not just support, but a sense of purpose. He realized that his experience, painful though it was, gave him the ability to help others who were going through similar struggles. This too is one of the gifts that rock bottom can offer us. The chance to transform our pain into purpose, our struggles into strength that can lift others. But let's address another crucial aspect of rising from rock bottom, the role of hope. When we're at our lowest point, hope can seem like a distant, even foolish concept. The idea that things could get better, that we could rise from the ashes of our failures, can feel like a cruel joke. And yet, hope is absolutely essential to our ability to rise. Without it, we remain stuck at the bottom, unable to even imagine a way out, let alone take the first steps towards it. But here's the thing about hope. It doesn't have to be grand or all-encompassing. When we're at rock bottom, we don't need to believe that everything will be perfect, that all our problems will magically disappear. We just need to believe that things can be better. That change is possible. Think of hope as a small flame in a dark room. It doesn't immediately banish all the darkness, but it provides just enough light to see the next step. And the next. It's not about seeing the entire path out of the depths, but about having faith that a path exists and the courage to take the first step along it. I once knew a man who had lost everything: his business, his home, his savings, in a series of poor decisions and unfortunate circumstances. He found himself living in his car, feeling as though he had reached the absolute rock bottom of his life. But even in that moment of despair, he clung to a small hope. It wasn't hope that he would suddenly become wealthy again, or that all his problems would disappear. It was simply the hope that he could make it through one more day, that he could take one small step towards improving his situation. That small hope was enough. It got him through that day and the next and the next. It gave him the strength to seek help, to start rebuilding his life one small piece at a time. And over time, as he began to rise from his rock bottom, that small flame of hope grew into a blazing fire of determination and resilience. This man's story illustrates an important truth about rising from rock bottom. It's not usually a sudden, dramatic ascent. More often, it's a slow, steady climb marked by small victories and incremental progress. Each small step forward builds momentum, creates confidence, paves the way for the next step. So if you find yourself at rock bottom, don't wait for some grand, transformative moment. Look for small ways to move forward. Maybe it's making your bed in the morning, or going for a short walk, or reaching out to one person for support. These might seem like insignificant actions in the face of overwhelming challenges, but they're not. They're the first steps on your climb back up. Now let's consider another aspect of rising from rock bottom: the importance of redefining success. Often, our rock bottom moments come as a result of chasing a particular vision of success, one that perhaps wasn't truly aligned with our values or our authentic selves. When we hit rock bottom, we have the opportunity to question and redefine what success means to us. Is it about accumulating wealth and status? Is it about achieving a particular goal? Or is it perhaps about living in alignment with our values, nurturing meaningful relationships, contributing to something larger than ourselves? This redefinition of success is crucial because it shapes the direction of our rise. If we simply try to recreate the life we had before, we risk ending up back at the bottom. But if we use our rock bottom experience to reevaluate and realign our priorities, we can build something new, something more resilient and more truly satisfying. I'm reminded of a woman I once met who'd been a high-powered executive, working 80-hour weeks in pursuit of corporate success. Her rock bottom came in the form of a stress-induced health crisis that forced her to step away from her career. At first, she was devastated, feeling as though she had lost everything that defined her. But as she began to recover, she started to question the assumptions that had driven her relentless pursuit of professional achievement. She realized that in her single-minded focus on career success, she had neglected other areas of her life: her health, her relationships, her personal passions. As she rose from her rock bottom, she redefined success for herself. She started a small business that allowed her to use her skills in a way that aligned with her values. She prioritized her health and her relationships. And while her new life might have looked like a step down by her old standards, she found the herself happier and more fulfilled than she had ever been at the peak of her corporate career. This woman's story highlights another important truth about rising from rock bottom. Sometimes our rise takes us in unexpected directions. The path up from the bottom rarely looks like the path we were on before we fell, and that's okay. In fact, it's often for the best. As we continue our exploration of rising from rock bottom, let's consider another crucial aspect of this process, the role of resilience. You see, resilience isn't just about bouncing back from adversity. It's about bouncing back stronger, wiser, more capable than before. Think of resilience like a muscle. When we exercise a muscle, we actually create tiny tears in the muscle fibers. It's in the healing of these tears that the muscle grows stronger. In the same way, the challenges we face, the rock bottom moments we endure, can actually strengthen our resilience if we approach them with the right mindset. But how do we cultivate this resilience? How do we transform our falls into opportunities for growth? First, we must recognize that resilience isn't a fixed trait. It's not something you either have or don't have. It's a skill that can be developed, a capacity that can be expanded through practice and intention. Consider the story of a young athlete I once knew. From a young age, he had shown promise in his sport, rising quickly through the ranks. Success came easily to him, and he grew accustomed to being at the top. But then came a devastating injury, one that not only took him out of competition, but threatened to end his athletic career entirely. This was his rock bottom. Everything he had built his identity around was suddenly in jeopardy. The pain was not just physical, but emotional and psychological as well. For a time, he fell into despair, believing that his life as he knew it was over. But then slowly, something began to change. As he went through the grueling process of physical rehabilitation, he began to discover a strength within himself that he never knew he possessed. Each small victory, each increase in mobility, each reduction in pain, became a testament to his resilience. Moreover, he began to realize that his identity was not solely defined by his athletic achievements. He discovered other interests, other capabilities that he had neglected in his singular focus on sport. He began to see his injury not as an end, but as an opportunity for growth and self-discovery. By the time he was able to return to his sport, he was a different person. Yes, he was physically strong again, but more importantly, he developed a mental and emotional resilience that made him a far more formidable athlete and a more well-rounded human being than he had ever been before. This young man's story illustrates a crucial truth about resilience. It's not about avoiding falls or preventing rock bottom moments. It's about how we respond to these challenges when they inevitably come our way. But let's delve deeper into this idea. How exactly do we cultivate this kind of resilience? How do we transform our rock bottom moments into foundations for growth? One key aspect is perspective. When we're in the midst of a crisis, when we've hit rock bottom, it's easy to become myopic, to see only the pain and difficulty of our current situation. But resilience requires us to take a broader view. Think of it this way. Imagine you're looking at a painting with your nose pressed against the canvas. All you can see are individual brushstrokes, perhaps a blur of color. It's only when you step back that you can see the full image. Appreciate the artistry, understand the meaning of the work. In the same way, when we're at rock bottom, we need to find ways to step back from our immediate circumstances to see our situation as part of a larger picture. This doesn't mean minimizing our pain or pretending that our challenges aren't real. Rather, it's about recognizing that our current circumstances, however difficult, are not the whole of our story. One practical way to cultivate this perspective is through what I call the future self exercise. It works like, imagine yourself 5 years in the future, looking back on this current challenging period. What would that future self say to you now? What insights would they have? What would they want you to know? This exercise can be profoundly powerful. It reminds us that our current situation is temporary, that change is not only possible but inevitable. It helps us tap into our own wisdom and resilience even when we feel at our lowest. I once spoke with a woman who had used this technique during a period of deep depression. She described how, at her lowest point, she couldn't imagine a future for herself at all. But when she forced herself to envision a future self, to really engage with the exercise, she was surprised by what emerged. Her imagined future self spoke to her with compassion and understanding. This future self reminded her of her strength, of challenges she had overcome in the past. Most importantly, this future self assured her that this period of darkness would pass, that there was hope and joy waiting on the other side of her current struggle. This vision didn't immediately solve all her problems or lift her out of her depression, but it gave her a lifeline, a reason to keep going, a glimmer of hope to cling to. And over time, as she continued to engage with this future self, she found the strength to take the small steps that eventually led her out of her rock bottom. This story brings us to another crucial aspect of rising from rock bottom, the power of self-compassion. When we've fallen, when we've failed, it's all too easy to become our own harshest critics. We berate ourselves for our mistakes, punish ourselves for our perceived shortcomings. But this self-criticism, while it might feel justified, actually hinders our ability to rise. Think about it this way. If you saw a friend who had fallen into a hole, would you stand at the edge and shout down at them about how stupid they were to have fallen in? Of course not. You would offer a hand to help them up. You would speak words of encouragement. You would remind them of their strength. We need to learn to treat ourselves with the same kindness and compassion we would offer to a friend. This doesn't mean excusing mistakes or avoiding responsibility for our actions. Rather, it's about recognizing our common humanity, understanding that to fall, to fail, to hit rock bottom, these are all part of the human experience. When we can offer ourselves compassion, when we can speak to ourselves with kindness rather than criticism, we create an internal environment that fosters resilience and growth. We give ourselves the emotional support we need to get back up and try again. But self-compassion isn't always easy, especially when we're at our lowest point. So how do we cultivate it? One powerful technique is to practice what psychologists call self-distancing. This involves talking to yourself in the third person or by your own name rather than using I. For example, instead of saying to yourself, "I'm such a failure, I'll never get out of this mess," you might say, "You're going through a really tough time right now, but you've overcome challenges before, and you have the strength to overcome this too." This simple shift in language can have a profound effect. It helps create a bit of psychological distance between you and your thoughts, allowing you to see your situation more objectively and respond with greater compassion. I recall a conversation with a man who had used this technique during a period of unemployment. He described how, in the depths of his discouragement, he had started to write himself encouraging letters, addressing himself by name. At first, it felt awkward, even a bit silly. But as he continued the practice, he found that it allowed him to tap into a wellspring of self-compassion he didn't know he possessed. These letters became a lifeline for him, a daily reminder of his own worth and capability, independent of his employment status. And interestingly, he found that this practice of self-compassion didn't make him complacent or unmotivated. On the contrary, it gave him the emotional strength and resilience to persist in his job search, to handle rejection without being devastated, and eventually to land a position that was even better than the one he had lost. This story illustrates another important point about rising from rock bottom, the crucial role of mindset. You see, our mindset, our beliefs about ourselves and the world around us, shapes our experience in profound ways. It influences how we interpret events, how we respond to challenges, and ultimately, how effectively we're able to rise from our lowest points. One particularly powerful mindset shift is what psychologists call the growth mindset. This is the belief that our abilities and intelligence aren't fixed traits, but can be developed through effort, good strategies, and input from others. When we have a growth mindset, we see challenges not as threats to our self-image, but as opportunities to learn and grow. We view effort not as a sign of inadequacy, but as a necessary part of development. We see failure not as a final judgment on our abilities, but as feedback that can guide our future efforts. Adopting a growth mindset can transform how we experience and respond to rock-bottom moments. Instead of seeing these low points as evidence of our inadequacy or proof of our limitations, we can view them as opportunities for growth, as challenging but valuable learning experiences. Consider the story of a businessman I once met. He had experienced a spectacular failure, a business venture that had not only collapsed but had left him deeply in debt. By any measure, he had hit rock bottom. But what struck me about this man was his attitude toward his failure. Instead of being crushed by it, instead of seeing it as a final verdict on his abilities as an entrepreneur, he viewed it as a rich learning experience. He spoke about the insights he had gained, the skills he had developed through the challenging process of trying to save his business. He was already thinking about how he could apply these lessons to future ventures. This man's growth mindset didn't erase the very real pain and difficulty of his situation, but it did allow him to engage with his rock-bottom moment in a way that was ultimately constructive rather than destructive. It gave him a framework for understanding his experience that pointed toward future growth rather than permanent defeat. But let's be clear. Adopting a growth mindset, practicing self-compassion, cultivating resilience, these aren't magic solutions that will immediately lift us out of our lowest points. Rising from rock bottom is rarely a smooth or easy process. There will be setbacks, moments of doubt, times when it feels like we're sliding back down instead of climbing up. This is where another crucial element comes into play: persistence. The willingness to keep going, to keep trying, even when progress seems slow or non-existent. Think of it this way. When you're climbing out of a deep hole, you don't leap from the bottom to the top in one bound. You climb inch by inch, handhold by handhold. Sometimes you might slip and fall back a bit, but as long as you keep reaching for the next handhold, as long as you keep moving upward, you will eventually reach the top. This kind of persistence requires a particular kind of courage. Not the flashy, adrenaline-fueled courage of grand gestures, but the quiet, steady courage of showing up day after day, of trying again and again in the face of difficulty and discouragement. I'm reminded of a writer I once knew who had faced repeated rejection of her work. Each rejection felt like hitting rock bottom all over again. There were times when she was tempted to give up, to decide that she simply wasn't cut out to be a writer. But instead of giving up, she developed a ritual. Every time she received a rejection, she would allow herself to feel the disappointment, but then she would sit down and start working on a new story. She would remind herself that each rejection, each seeming failure, was bringing her one step closer to success. It took years, but eventually her persistence paid off. She not only got her work published, but became a best-selling author. When asked about her success, she always pointed to those years of rejection as the crucible in which her talent. It was her willingness to persist, to keep rising from each small rock bottom, that ultimately led to her success. This writer's story brings us to another important point about rising from rock bottom: the power of reframing our experiences. You see, the meaning we assign to our experiences shapes how we respond to them, and often we have more control over this meaning-making process than we realize. When we hit rock bottom, it's easy to frame our experience in purely negative terms, as a disaster, humiliation, a proof of our inadequacy. But what if we chose to frame it differently? What if we saw it as a turning point, a wake-up call, an opportunity for a fresh start? This isn't about denying the reality of our pain or the difficulty of our circumstances. It's about choosing to see beyond the immediate hardship to the potential for growth and transformation that lies within it. I once spoke with a man who had lost his job in his late 50s. At first, he saw this as a catastrophe, the end of his career, a humiliating failure at the tail end of his working life. But as he grappled with his situation, he realized that he had been unhappy in his job for years, staying only because of the security it provided. Losing that job forced him to confront some hard truths about his life and his choices, but it also freed him to pursue interests he had long neglected. He began to see his job loss not as the end of his productive life, but as an opportunity to redefine what a productive life meant to him. He ended up starting a small business based on a long-time hobby, something he never would have had the courage to do if he hadn't hit rock bottom. And while the path wasn't easy, he found a level of satisfaction and fulfillment in this new venture that he had never experienced in his previous career. This man's story illustrates a profound truth about rising from rock bottom. Often, our rise takes us to places we never could have imagined when we were standing on supposedly solid ground. Our rock bottom moments, painful though they may be, can serve as springboards launching us toward new possibilities, new ways of being in the world. But to access these possibilities, we need to be willing to let go of our preconceived notions about what our life should look like. We need to be open to the idea that our rise might take us in unexpected directions. This openness, this willingness to embrace the unknown, is another key aspect of effectively rising from rock bottom. It requires a certain kind of courage, the courage to step into uncertainty, to release our grip on the familiar even when the familiar has failed us. Think about it this way. When you're at rock bottom, you're already in unfamiliar territory. Everything you thought you knew, everything you relied on, has been upended. In this situation, clinging to old ideas about who you are and what your life should look like can actually hinder your ability to rise. Instead, rock bottom offers us the opportunity to ask ourselves some profound questions. Who am I without the trappings of success I've lost? What do I truly value? What kind of life do I want to create now that my old life has gone? These are not easy questions to answer. They require deep reflection, honest self-examination, and a willingness to challenge our most basic assumptions about ourselves and our place in the world. But in grappling with these questions, we begin the process of not just rising from rock bottom, but rising renewed, with a clearer sense of purpose and a stronger connection to our authentic selves. I'm reminded of a woman I once met who had gone through a painful divorce in her 40s. She described her initial experience of rock bottom as a kind of free fall. Everything she had built her life around had suddenly disappeared. Her identity as a wife, her plans for the future, her sense of security, all of it was gone. But as she began to rebuild her life, she realized that this rock bottom moment had given her an opportunity she had never had before. The chance to discover who she truly was, apart from her roles and relationships. She began to explore interests she had neglected during her marriage. She reconnected with old friends and made new ones. She discovered strengths and capabilities she never knew she possessed. 5 years after her divorce, she described her rock bottom moment as the most painful but also the most transformative experience of her life. I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone, she told me, but I'm grateful for who I've become because of it. This woman's story encapsulates so much of what we've discussed about rising from rock bottom. The initial pain and disorientation, the slow process of rebuilding, the discovery of new strengths and possibilities, the transformation of a painful experience into a source of growth and renewal. As we draw our discussion to a close, I want to leave you with a final thought. If you find yourself at rock bottom, or if you ever do in the future, remember this, your story isn't over. This low point, however painful, however devastating it might feel, is not the end. It's a chapter, perhaps the most challenging chapter of your life, but it's not the whole book. What comes next is, in large part, up to you. Will you allow this experience to define you, to limit you, or will you use it as a foundation upon which to build a new, perhaps even more meaningful life? The choice is yours. And yes, it is a choice. It might not feel like it when you're in the depths of despair, when the walls of that metaphorical hole feel impossibly high and slippery. but I assure you, you have more power than you realize. You have the power to change your perspective, to reframe your experience. You have the power to practice self-compassion, to treat yourself with the same kindness you would offer a friend. You have the power to adopt a growth mindset, to view your challenges as opportunities for learning and development. You have the power to persist,